Welcome back. In this video, we'll be covering the second half of Learning Objective 13.1 for PSY 235 Social Psychology. In the last video, we mainly discussed the cognitive aspects of prejudice. Now we're moving on to look at the affective component or the emotional aspects of prejudice. As your authors put it, the emotional aspect of attitudes makes it hard to argue with people who hold prejudices because logical arguments don't work when you're up against emotion. Now, I talked about this in a previous chapter, in the chapter on attitudes. If you're trying to change people's attitudes and their attitudes are affectively based or they're based on emotion, it is really hard to challenge them with facts. You've probably had, in the past 5 years, some argument at some point in time where somebody had a prejudicial attitude that was very emotionally based, and you tried to argue with facts. I'm gonna guess it didn't go well. So if we try to come at these prejudicial emotions with a lot of counter arguments, we often fail. So let's dig a little harder under the surface with these affective components of prejudice. Because we often, we run up against this a lot where we think we see the world in one way, but other people see it in a completely different way. And if we could just clarify the arguments for them, give them the facts, they would change their mind, and then we're shocked when it doesn't work. Part of the problem is that when we use emotional reasoning, so if people are coming at a group of people that they don't identify with, that they have defined as other, they often perceive those individuals as a source of potential threat. They may be using other or experiencing other negative emotions like anger over competing for resources, maybe disgust for not understanding their lifestyle, for disagreeing with their behaviors. Emotional reasoning is almost impossible to deal with using a logical or evidence-based approach. Fear, the perception of threat, feeling angry, feeling terrified, feeling disgust, those are emotional responses. They're negative emotions. They're very strong and they're designed from an evolutionary basis to protect us from actual threats. So now that we're in this, a different kind of world, detached from many of the threats to our existence, we still use those old kind of brain ways of perceiving the world through our emotions. And when we're driven by those emotions, you cannot come at that with logic. You have to come at it with emotion. The emotional component basically is very, very deep-seated. These are very negative feelings. They're primarily in the form of fear, anger, and disgust are the primary forms that they take. And even if a person consciously says prejudice is wrong, that they shouldn't think these things, when there's those deep-seated emotions, it's very hard to convert those attitudes. Now, one study that I've found really useful for kind of wrapping my head around these ideas was conducted by Fisk, Cuddy, and Glick. And they talk about how stereotypes really they're really connected to the emotional reactions to different kinds of groups. And their model proposes that you have two basic dimensions that you use on a regular basis. There are lots and lots of other dimensions too, but these are the ones we use on a regular basis to kind of size people up. We have attitudes that run from warm to cold, and we have perceptions, beliefs, stereotypes that run from incompetent to competent. And how do we respond to people depends on the intersections between them. If you have warm attitudes toward a group that you typically believe is competent, you tend to admire them. If, however, you have colder attitudes, meaning dislike toward a particular group that you also still see as competent, you may envy them. So let's say that there's someone who's incredibly successful in business and is very wealthy, but you don't like them and you don't like the group they represent, that may translate into the emotion of envy. If you have cold attitudes and you believe that the group is incompetent, so you don't like them and you think they're incompetent, that can lead toward contemptuous feelings, hatred, in other words. And then finally, you can feel warmly toward a group, but if you perceive them to be incompetent, you're simultaneously going to feel pity. Pity is another one of those nasty little emotions that on the surface it could have a sort of positive vibe. I feel so sad for them. You have warm attitudes, you like charitable attitudes, but you feel so bad for them that it takes the form of pity. Pity tends to lead to behaviors of avoidance, as opposed to empathy, which tends to lead to approach. The behavioral component is what we call discrimination. So basically, discrimination refers to negative or harmful actions taken toward a member of a group, just because the person is a member of the group. And there are lots of ways that this can take place. It can take place on an individual level. An individual could say, I hate that social group, and they see a person and they have pigeonholed them in that social group, and then they strike out at them in a hostile way, or they refuse to give them a job, or they refuse to rent their house to them, or they deny them membership in an organization because they're a person in that group. Those are all unjustified, negative, harmful actions taken toward that person because they are believed to be a member of that group. Discrimination can also be institutionalized. And I know that this is an not necessarily comfortable topic of conversation at this current historical time in the United States, but your authors talk about the construct of institutionalized discrimination, which there's tremendous amount of evidence to support the idea of it, coming from multiple disciplines, from sociology, from economics, from psychology, from political science, across the board. Basically, what institutionalized discrimination means is that you have systemic denials of opportunity, denials of rights, just based on the way society has been constructed and the way it functions. And it becomes so normalized that people don't see it as a problem. Institutional discrimination is going to have differential impacts on groups. So some groups are going to be very devastatingly impacted. Other groups, not so much. So one common example that can be given, because institutional discrimination could come in terms of educational policies and procedures, housing, employment, healthcare, getting loans, the criminal justice system, etc. One example, I was listening to this really interesting conversation about the history of neighborhood structures in Akron, Ohio. And there was a story about how, the history of the highway placements really resulted in intense segregation called redlining, and that at the time that many of these decisions were made, the decision of where the highways would go was really determined by who was living where the highway was going to land at the time. And some of the neighborhoods that were destroyed were predominantly African American neighborhoods, and that meant that those people were when they relocated, they really had very few options and ended up in even more densely populated areas that were predominantly African American. And since there were systemic discrimination in terms of who could get housing loans, a lot of these people were relegated to rentals, to living in places with less access to health care, less access to grocery stores, more reliance on convenience stores, or say the Dollar Generals of the world. Their housing was substandard, leaving them more vulnerable to a whole host of things that had impacts on health. The school systems and the locations where they could afford to live were often underfunded, and the buildings themselves were not well cared for. So that's what we mean by institutionalized discrimination. Another example, just from the history of women's rights in the United States, it really wasn't until well into the 1970s that women could actually have access to the economic system in their own names. I remember distinctly when my mother got her first credit card with her name on it. And it was in the mid 70s, maybe the late 1970s. She was so excited. She was finally allowed to get a credit card with her name on it. Prior to that time, it wasn't allowed. Banks saw women as a poor risk, that they didn't have incomes of their own. They couldn't possibly pay their debts. So their husbands or their fathers had to get credit cards and then allow them to be a user on the card. So that's another example of institutionalized discrimination. There are also everyday slights, everyday forms of discrimination. So you don't have to just see sort of the big picture discrimination events that involve, say, violence or denial of services. It's also in the everyday little things. There was this trend that showed up on, I think I first saw it on Instagram, where you had images like the ones I'm showing on this screen. There was a kind of a mini movement among younger people to post images that showed microaggressions that they had experienced. And what microaggressions are, just little tiny, or maybe not so tiny, indignities that people are forced to endure. Just little put downs that the person who utters them may not think are put downs, but they're put downs. They're often directed at people who are racial or ethnic minorities, or they're people with disabilities. So like what you can see in some of these images are based on stereotypes. So like on the far left, you have a young man who is assumed to have certain characteristics because of his disability. Oftentimes African Americans, it's assumed that they don't swim, that they don't dive. That's a stereotype of Black people. The young man in the middle, stereotype that you have to be, if you're Black, you should be able to be athletic, and so on and so on and so on. So these are microaggressions. They are assumptions about people that we just kind of mindlessly, perhaps not intentionally, toss about. In Carell et al.'s research, they talk about, how do we make the jump then from prejudice, that's an attitude, so prejudicial attitudes, to actual discriminatory behavior. And that is harder to study in the laboratory than you might think. So researchers have to be creative. They have to be a bit crafty. And the study, the Carell et al. Study from 2002 is pretty typical of designs in this domain in social psychology. So as your authors described it, what they did in their study, they had white participants who saw videos of young men in realistic settings. The pictures were, or the videos rather, were of half of them were African American men and half were white. And then half the men in these videos were shown holding a gun, and half were holding non-threatening objects, things like cell phones or whatever. The participants were seated at a computer because, as we saw in the aggression chapter, we have to use techniques that don't involve ethically violating anyone's rights or putting them in danger. So you're not going to put them in a situation where they can actually harm another person. So they have to push a button on a computer. Those of you who are gamers, you're familiar with using certain keys on your keyboard to take different actions. So they had a quote-unquote shoot button. It would be represented, I'm picking letters out of a hat, by the L button on your keyboard versus the don't shoot button, which might be the A button. Participants had to make a decision. Shoot if they saw the gun, don't shoot if they did not, right? And what they found was that for white participants in particular, they were especially likely to press that shoot button when the men in the videos were black, whether or not they had a gun. So what that reflected for these researchers was a tendency for, in these decision-making situations, for them to show what's referred to as a shooter bias. So they made, when you look at these participants' decisions, they made relatively few errors when a black person was actually in the video holding a gun. They made the most errors when a black person in the video was not holding a gun. So when we look at this in graphical form, and you're looking at the shooter bias effect, so these were, all of the participants were white in this particular version of the study. When the person in the video or photo was white, there's no real difference between a target in the video that is armed versus not armed. If, however, the person depicted in the video is black, you have a higher percentage of errors. So shooting an unarmed person when the person in the video is black. That's what's referred to as shooter bias. Now, obviously, what the researchers were really trying to tease out was errors made. So the real social problem in the real world is instances where you have people in law enforcement mistakenly shoot a person who wasn't actually armed. And the real big social question was, does this happen more often with black male targets? And what research like this shows is that that's entirely possible. Now, what we can't say is, based on these findings, does that mean that there's a shooter bias among the police? Well, that is a question that's very challenging to answer, very, very difficult to answer in reality, because every individual police officer is different, every police force is different, and so on. That said, it suggests that based on our underlying prejudices, we can in fact show that people's behaviors can be affected. They may not know that their behavior is being affected, but it is. So in the next video, where I continue to look at prejudice, we'll be switching gears a little bit to look at how do we do these measurements. So we've seen the study of the shooter bias. What are some other ways that social psychologists study hidden prejudices?